All right, welcome everybody to this week's class of Intro to Christian Theology. This week we're going to be looking at the Atonement, the work of the God who is for us. There is a fair bit of reading this week, as you've probably noticed. The perusal reading is quite short. It's the passage from Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich. And while being short, it is quite dense, and this translation is in a bit older English. So if you find it difficult, that's okay. It is a difficult text, and that's why there's not very much of it. If you're having trouble with it, I would recommend going to the Eugene Rogers textbook first and reading through it. And he's got a nice little chapter in there on Julian, and so that'll kind of help orient you to what Julian's up to in that other passage. All right, so I guess that's the housekeeping bit taken care of. So we want to talk about the atonement. We've been on a bit of a journey in this class through some various doctrinal loci, and that just means various kind of like topics in systematic theology. And the order is not my order. I'm borrowing it from the way Eugene Rogers is laying out this class in his textbook. But you might start to see a bit of a logic emerging. So we started with, theological methods and that kind of thing. But then as we started to get into the doctrine proper, we begin with this idea of election and the God who chooses to be the God for us. And then we move from the doctrine of election to ask, okay, well, what does it entail to be the God who is for us? And so we talk about the doctrine of the incarnation, how it is that Christ took on our human nature in order to be the God that is for us. And this week we kind of continue that basic thrust of the God who is for us by asking some questions about, okay, well, what does God accomplish by being this God who is for us? What work is God up to? And so that's kind of the underlying question here in this doctrine of what is it that God is doing kind of on our behalf? The doctrine of atonement is kind of located under the more general topic of soteriology. Soteriology comes from the Greek words which mean kind of like soter and logos. We kind of would gloss that as something like the study of salvation, something like that. But basically just the broad heading of God's saving work. And then atonement is typically thought to be the kind of like particular mechanism. So if we think of a broad bucket of God's saving work, and then atonement is usually talked about in terms of like a theory or a mechanism by which God accomplishes that saving work. Atonement, a way to kind of like remember what this word means is just to kind of break it apart, to read it quite literally as at-one-ment. In other words, kind of the bringing together of those who've been alienated from each other. And in theology, we would think of primarily the alienation caused by sin between us and God. But more generally, atonement is kind of some sort of reconciliation or reparation for some kind of harm, a kind of a making right, that kind of thing. And most specifically, it's the kind of when you use the word atonement, usually, or atoning, usually kind of it's attached to some mechanism that is actually doing the setting right. So as we'll get to in a moment, when you look through scriptures, where the word atonement or atoning kind of shows up a lot is in the sacrificial system of Israel. There'll be all sorts of atoning sacrifices. Sometimes that's animals, sometimes it's in the form of money. But it's typically attached specifically to that mechanism that does the atoning work. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clarifies the relationship of atonement specifically is kind of when we're talking about the mechanism that does the atoning work of God's grander saving work generally. All right, what do we mean by salvation, though? Not every religious tradition talks about salvation the same way. Some people figure that we don't really even need saving all that much. I think that there are some helpful kind of like rules or guidelines that kind of shape how Christians talk about salvation, or certain kinds of operative assumptions, anyways. The first of these is that there is some sort of situation that we require saving from. And as you will read in the Rogers textbook, there is a bunch of different ways of framing what exactly that issue is that we require saving from. But I think it doesn't take a lot of convincing for most people to convince them that when you look around at the world, most people agree that not everything is perhaps as it should be, right? We could imagine a slightly better world, or perhaps even a much better world. There seems to be something not quite right. And what we think is wrong is going to depend on a bunch of different factors. But I think there is a kind of general agreement that the world is not quite right, and we don't really know how to get ourselves out of that. Or we might have ideas of how to do it, but we can't seem to quite get it done. Christians have kind of named this sense sin. And we're gonna kind of like clarify a little bit what we mean and don't mean by sin. But first, some of the other assumptions that are operated in the Christian kind of notion of salvation. Whatever our situation is that we find ourselves in, this is generally taken to be something that we can't quite get ourselves out of on our own. Now, there is like a fair bit of disagreement and argument about our own participation in our salvation. So on the far extreme end, you'll have a kind of a Pelagian impulse that would say something like, well, and this shows up perhaps most vividly in Abelard, in one of the examples that you're going to read about this week. This idea that like really all it kind of takes is a subjective kind of like changing of our minds, and then if we kind of like do all the right things, we can like accomplish our own salvation. This would be kind of like the thought process of the rich young ruler in the Gospels, right? Who comes to Jesus and says, you know, I've kept the law all my life. I've done everything required. What more must I do to be saved? And Jesus says, you know, give away all your riches to the poor. And he goes away quite sad about this. And the point of the story is not to show that this young man is a hypocrite or anything. In fact, like you should see him almost as like a Job-like figure, right? Like Job was blessed by God because he followed the law and he did nothing wrong in God's eyes. So there is an assumption, at least in like Israelite religion, that like there is actually a form of life where you can live righteously, that you can perfectly follow the law. That is something that like is within our power to do, according to kind of Israelite religion, and that's reflected in the Old Testament. And yet, and that like the wealth and the blessing that will flow, that kind of is promised in Deuteronomy, right? Like if you follow my law and keep my commandments, then you will experience long life in the land, blessings, wealth, all that kind of stuff. If you disobey me, if you disobey my commands, forget my laws, then you will be punished, die, be expelled from the land. And of course, we know that this passage in Deuteronomy is setting up for the eventual kind of like grand arc of Israel, which ultimately culminates in exile because they do not, as a nation, keep the law. But with the rich young ruler, he is somebody who, as evidenced by, having all these riches and having all these blessings, is somebody who has kept the law, has done everything right, and then comes to Jesus and said, "What must I do to be saved?" Clearly, there's something still that he's experiencing that's not quite salvation. Or another way of looking at it is that Jesus is a kind of considered a rabbi and might have a specific teaching around what must be done to be saved. And so to cover his bases as like a good righteous Jew, the rich young ruler is kind of going to this new rabbi and saying, "Hey, what is your take on how I need to live in order to be saved?" And Christ asks him to give back all the blessings that he's received. And this becomes a huge challenge to the rich young ruler, and he goes away quite sad. Now, we don't know what the rich young ruler actually ended up doing, right? But Jesus comments that it is actually one of these things that this isn't quite something that we do entirely of our own power. So in the history of Christianity, there have been those who have tended towards the side of kind of Abelard or Pelagius, who would say that no, like really, we can follow the law right, we can live righteously, we can, in effect, kind of like achieve our own salvation. And there have been others who kind of follow what we might call a more like Augustinian approach, who say, no, the problem of sin is actually much more complicated than that. And even when we think we have kind of like gotten our way out of it, we might still be ensnared in ways that we've missed. And so this is not a problem that we can get out of on our own. And I think the mainstream of Christianity has agreed with the Augustinian tradition. Some of you have been asking, I talk a lot about the various options that are available within the Christian tradition. And I do that on purpose because a lot of people are raised with just kind of like one version of these doctrines. And I want to point out that there are actually options, and that the one that you might have been raised with isn't the only way that people might think about these things. You might walk away from this class thinking that what you thought coming in was all the right answers on all these things. That's fair enough. But I hope that you will see that there are at least good reasons why there are Christians who may disagree with you. And they're not just disagreeing with you because they're evil, stupid, and wrong, but rather because there are just these various traditions. I think, though, that on the question of like how involved we can be in our own salvation, the bulk of the tradition kind of comes down on this side that says like this is something that we can't quite pull off on our own, and in fact is only something God can do. That still leaves quite a lot of room for talking about how we might participate in some way in our salvation, and that there will be some who insist we participate in no way. And as you'll notice on Eugene Rogers' kind of like typology there, in most of these models of atonement, there is some kind of limited way in which we have a role of sorts. But I think one of the things that might help clarify that is the distinction we talked about last week in terms of the non-competitive relationship between divine action and human action. So there is a way that we can think about human participation in our own salvation in a way that doesn't say that that it's a zero-sum game, right? That if God is accomplishing it really and truly, that means there's absolutely nothing that we can be doing. Or if we're doing anything, that's in some way implicating that God's not accomplishing it. There might be a way to think about it whereby God is really accomplishing it, and also there's good work for us to be doing in that process. How that all plays out will kind of depend on the model, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The problem, I've been kind of using this word of the situation or a problem that we find ourselves in that we need saving from. Christians call this sin. And sin is a word that a lot of people are like uncomfortable with now because it's been weaponized in all sorts of ways. I think it's actually a super useful category for thinking with, but I think we could think of a bunch of different ways that this word sin gets used to help clarify what we want to mean with this word and maybe what we don't. But when you're reading, you will find, even in Julian, you'll find her talking about sin in a bunch of different ways. So sin isn't all kind of one thing for Julian. And there tends to be this kind of slippage. And I think that what that reflects is the actually like the multifaceted nature of sin, and the way that sin has a kind of wiliness about it, and a kind of an absurdity about it that stops us from quite like naming it or capturing it conceptually. So we can ask, what is sin? Well, the version that you probably are most familiar with from if you grew up in the church, sins are kind of like specific bad actions, right? Confess your sins. And usually people would say, name like the specific bad things that you've done. And they might even create elaborate lists of what counts as sins or not. My friends used to always jokingly give me a hard time about going dancing because, of course, dancing might lead to babies. There's a joke in the Mennonite tradition about the reason why you shouldn't have sex before marriage is because it might accidentally lead to dancing. So this is a kind of a conception of sin, where sin is just understood as like specific bad actions, and these are like kind of various taboos that a community might have, and they may or may not actually be derived from the scriptures, or they might be derived from a rather selective reading of the scriptures. I grew up in a community where drinking was a sin. Never mind that, Jesus made pots and pots of wine for everybody to get absolutely sloshed at the wedding at Cana. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, the popular notion of sin is kind of specific actions. Some people talk about sin as a kind of an individual condition. You might think of kind of like doctrines of original sin or something like that, where like sin is, you have this sin nature, this tendency towards sin. And there's various ways of like understanding how you came to have this, but there is just something kind of like deviant or wrong about you that makes you perpetually do the wrong thing. And you see this kind of thing in like the way that like St. Paul talks about like, his spirit wants to do one thing, but his flesh, always makes him do the other thing. And I think like a lot of us have that experience of like finding your will working at cross purposes with itself, and like kind of always choosing the thing that's not good for you. We have like a lot of different ways now from like behavioral psychology or whatever to talk about this kind of phenomena where we like self-sabotage or undermine ourselves, or we have like addictions to things or whatever. But that kind of thing kind of like points to this general way in which like sin or some sort of problem can be like this like individual condition. Now the question becomes like, if you are moving, if you're thinking in your brain that sin is like primarily bad things that you do, therefore like you have some sort of moral culpability for them, and then you move from that definition to like sin is like a condition that you have, where people get worried is that you might be saying something like, oh, like you are morally culpable for this kind of thing, And people don't want to talk about, like, say, an addiction or some sort of like predilection for something as being like inherently sinful, because this makes it seem like this is something you're morally culpable for, in the same way that you're morally culpable for like freely chosen bad actions, right? Uh, and that's a really good critique. I think, though, that we can still think of like sin as being this thing that we're like caught in the way people talk about like being caught in an addiction. It's some sort of situation that they can't get themselves out of, that they really desperately maybe want to get out of, but find themselves kind of like plagued or beset by it. So this might, you might think of it as like, jumping down a couple on my list there, as like a disease, right? Like something that like almost comes to you externally, but has you mired it in some way and is like making you sick. Like you don't want this, but it's making you sick, and it just keeps making you more sick. That is something that you need to be healed from, right? And as we'll look at in a moment, there are like a lot of scriptures about sin as something that we need healing from, and God being the kind of the great physician and that kind of thing. So sin could be kind of understood in this way as being kind of like caught up, something that you're caught up in. Similarly, it could be like a social structure, right? Like we talk about, sometimes you'll hear people talk about like kind of the original sin of America being racism or black slavery. And on the one hand, there is like a specific bad action in there, targeting a specific racial group, in fact, constructing a specific racial group by way of enslaving them and subjugating them in this kind of way. So there's like specific bad actions tied up in it, but it also is like the construction of a social structure that actually wounds everybody involved, both master and slave, in different kinds of ways, right? There's a certain kind of moral injury by being involved in the slave trade. And there's a very real kind of like injury and oppression by being a slave, right? So this is a structure that we could name as sin and sinful, that is that there, involves specific bad actions, but isn't kind of like reducible to that, and in fact is so much more than that, right? And is also something that's very hard to escape from on your own. And it's a structure that, even though slavery has been formally abolished, is one of these structures that continues to kind of like press on our society in all sorts of different kinds of ways, and continues to have these kind of lasting effects and lasting wounds in all sorts of ways that we're still dealing with on an ongoing basis. And it's not kind of this steady line of progress away from it. Because of the way that that sin kind of acts in these kind of structural ways, or in these miring ways, like a disease, some people have thought of it as an almost like an apocalyptic power, right? Like a malevolent force that somehow, maybe is associated with the devil or something. But the very real ways that like it's a way of naming the powers of this world that kind of deal out death and destruction. I had a friend in seminary who wrote his master's thesis on a kind of a critique of the powers. And he said, the powers, the scriptures talk about the powers and the principalities and that kind of thing. And these are probably, like, traditionally Christians have thought of them as kind of like a kind of a rank of angel or something, like a rank of an angelic being, something like that. But he said, well, what if we think of them as like the various kind of like actual powers or principalities of our society, right? Like, so that could be like corporations or governments or any kind of like locus of power, structural power in our society. He said these things themselves aren't bad. Like, they're created good. They are positive beings in a kind of way. But they do tend to, like, these kinds of institutions, these kinds of powers, they tend to have like a kind of a death dealing nature to them often, right? Like we can just list example after example of kind of every kind of institution, how it can and has gone wrong, right? But we know that like institutions often perform all sorts of good things, and yet they have these certain like tendencies to go wrong. And so he says the powers are good, the powers are fallen, and the powers can be redeemed. That was his little mantra that he would talk about. And he went on to have a career in politics. But this might be kind of one way of thinking about these kind of apocalyptic powers, the way in which like we are confronted with all sorts of powers and forces of power as we navigate life. And yet they can take on a kind of malevolent or diabolical nature so often. And we find ourselves having to kind of do battle with them. And sometimes, it has felt to many Christians that there is something spiritual about this, that there's something almost superhuman almost about these things. And so, people have named them as diabolical or associated with the devil and his minions and that kind of thing. You can think of it in any way you want to, but these are kind of like some of the metaphors that folks have kind of used to kind of like expand the ways in which sin might occasionally have to do with like specific bad acts. And I think most people, when they talk about sin, they will occasionally refer to sin in that kind of colloquial way. But often they will start ramping it up into one of these more kind of like complicated, multivalent, structural forms of sin that kind of mire us in all kinds of ways. One of the reasons why it's so difficult to get a handle on what sin is because sin and evil, as we'll talk about with Julian at the end, are actually things that they have no positive being. So while we encounter sin and evil as something that is real, there is a certain kind of like ontological set of distinctions that need to be made here. When God creates only good creatures. And yet we encounter so much of creation as evil in some ways, right? So what are we to make of that? You have a few different options, right? One option is that if God is a force for good and creating good things, then there's an equal force for evil. This is the Manichaean teaching, the ancient Christian heresy that Augustine was a part of for part of his younger years. That there are basically two kind of cosmic powers in the universe, one good, one evil, and they're kind of forever locked in a duel. Christianity doesn't actually teach that, though, right? It doesn't teach that there is an equal but opposite power to God. No, there's only one God, and that God is good and pure and holy. And anytime we might talk about, the powers or the devil being something that God is at war with, it's not an equal fight. And in fact, like when you read the book of Revelation, for example, and like Michael and his angels go to war against the devil and his angels and immediately kick his ass. So this is not exactly like a fair fight if there even is an alternate power. Okay, so if there's not two kind of equal powers, one good, one evil, then there's two more options. The next option is that God is the author of all things good and all things evil. But then that raises a bunch of problems for us because we want to talk about God in the Christian tradition as being wholly good, all powerful, all knowing, all loving. That runs afoul. How can God be kind of like all good and all powerful and being like the creator of evil? You run into some contradictions there, some paradoxes. And is that really something that, do we really want to be kind of like asserting that of God? Because if God is the kind of God that creates evil things, then the really real question becomes: is God a monster? And is God the author of monstrous things? Perhaps, but then why would we worship this God, right? And so then the kind of the atheist critique, that kind of moral critique of God being a moral monster, holds quite a lot of water if we want to affirm that. And I don't think that's something that I want to affirm. The final option is that God creates good things, and what evil is some sort of privation or perversion of good things. And so evil is not a thing. Evil is only and always a negation of a thing. So remember, we talked about in a previous lecture the kind of how kind of like metaphysical or ontological speculation gets off the ground. It just kind of is based on kind of like thinking really hard about how we talk about things, right? So if you can predicate stuff about something, that means there's like an underlying thingness, which we would call an essence or a substance, and then we can say things about it, right? So when we're talking about evil, what Christian kind of philosophers have concluded is that evil does not have an underlying like substance or isness to it. Rather, evil is kind of a modifier of some good underlying substance. So the underlying substance is good, and it is somehow perverted or deprived or negated in some kind of way, or trending towards death, destruction, alienation. And this kind of follows from the Christian doctrine of creation, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. But really early on, Christians affirmed that God creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. And there's a principle in philosophy and in physics and everything that nothing can come out of nothing, right? And so this is an assertion that God kind of radically creates where there wasn't anything before. Now the problem, the offense of evil and sin, is that it somehow is the undoing of God's creative act, right? That if God says, let there be light, let there be land, let there be creatures and humans and trees, well, whatever sin is the kind of like the decaying, the wasting away, the killing off of that, the undoing of it, the no to God's yes. Well, obviously, if God is all powerful and all good, then it's like it would be an affront to God for God's yes to be kind of like determinatively undermined. And so to this problem of sin, to this problem of the kind of the forces of death and evil, and the way in which things like want to that created things have this ability to kind of like go back towards non-being, when God has kind of given them his, God's ultimate yes to their being, yes to their living, then God has to act in order to kind of stop creation from self-destructing. And so if we think of God's kind of saving work is kind of like guided by, God's kind of like determination to create and be there for that which God creates, then that's where like salvation flows from, as a response to the way in which these things are somehow going wrong, somehow becoming a negation, not a real thing. All right. Well, that's enough about sin for now. I wanted to use this one last metaphor to kind of talk about sin as something that um, we find ourselves kind of trapped in and we can't get out of on our own. And it's always a bigger problem than maybe we even realize. So there's a philosopher named Timothy Morton, and he's part of a school of philosophy called object oriented ontology. And that's not really important for you to know. What is important for you to know is that he coined this term called hyperobjects. What is a hyperobject? Well, hyperobjects are objects which have a vitality to them, but you can't touch them, like race or class or climate change. Their effects may be experienced even if they cannot be necessarily touched. Um, Morton goes on to say that hyperobjects have a bunch of different kind of properties, one of which he says the hyperobjects are viscous. And what he means by viscous is hyperobjects seem to adhere to any other object they touch, no matter how hard an object tries to resist. In this way, hyperobjects overrule ironic distance, meaning that the more an object tries to resist a hyperobject, the more glued to the hyperobject it becomes. Hyperobjects for Morton are a kind of a grammatical tool that allows us to talk about something that's really big and kind of like defines objectification, right? So again, think about grammar, and in a sentence, you have the subject of the sentence and the object of the sentence, right? Um, when you kind of like identify something as the object of a sentence, you can be said to objectify it, and that is to kind of like grasp it linguistically as an object, something that you can kind of conceptually hold. Well, Morton wants to say, okay, we need to be able to talk about some of these massively ramified phenomena in our world, like race and class and climate change, but to just like name them with one concept kind of like fails to capture their totality. They're too big for that. And they're also kind of like self-undermining and like absurd, and also like more than they have, and so they're just really impossible to actually hold on to. So they're so big. We'll call them a hyper object. Um, and in this way, we can at least kind of like talk about them without without ever affirming that we've actually really kind of done justice to kind of like how big the issue is. And so he talks about this with the climate crisis, because it's such a big thing. It's global in scale, and simultaneously, it's one of these bizarre phenomena where everybody is to blame for it. Like as consumers, basically every part of our life is contributing to it. Us doing this class right now, right, is actually contributing to climate change, because as much as like none of us had to drive to a class, so you might think, oh, it's a fairly low carbon way of teaching. In fact, the fact that I'm going to like upload this to YouTube and it's going to sit on some servers somewhere, well, those servers are running all the time. And guess what they're running on? Electricity. And it takes a lot of electricity to run a server farm. And they are major contributors to, you know, our energy use, and a lot of that is produced with fossil fuel energy sources. And so by kind of like having this online class, by meeting on Zoom a bunch of times, that has a real carbon cost to it. It might be less than us all kind of like flying together to meet in Halifax, sure, but it's not nil. Um, just by eating and having homes and heating those homes and all those kinds of things, we are to blame. We are part of the problem, even when we take kind of like mediating steps to try and kind of like reduce our impact. But at the same time as everybody's to blame, there's nobody really like specifically to blame, right? Like this is a problem that has been growing for a couple centuries since the Industrial Revolution. And it's not like you can point to one person or one thing that's like, they are to blame. And also, like, as much as each one of us is contributing to the climate crisis by virtue of being consumers in kind of late capitalist societies, it's not like we have much of a choice to that, right? Like, we are just born into these societies. And so, like, what are we supposed to do? Just like move into the bush and die? Or, like, there's a certain sense in which, like, we can try and make better choices, but this is kind of the world that we have been thrown into. And so the level of culpability that we have might be kind of low, even though we're still implicated in it, right? So we're still kind of the cause of it. And also, we're going to increasingly be feeling the effects of it, right? We're increasingly going to be wounded by it. Now, the people who benefit most from the kind of the exploitative forces that are driving the climate crisis are actually going to least likely feel its effects, but not always, right? We can all remember not that long ago when the city of Fort McMurray was like wiped out by forest fires, and those forest fires were exacerbated by climate change, but also how humans have decided to like manage forest ecosystems for the last couple centuries in ways that are kind of like contrary to the ways that those ecosystems were evolved to be managed. So a lot of people, made a lot of somewhat like cheap comparisons saying like, hey, look, Fort McMurray, the place where they're pulling all this oil out of the ground, is also the place that's getting like hit first by the climate crisis. And I mean, that's kind of true. Eco theologians, environmental activists, and others, they talk a lot about kind of sacrifice zones as being increasingly a common problem in the climate crisis, or shadow places, these places that we offer up to be the sites of destruction as the price of our consumption. And us as consumers, or the people who own the companies who are doing the extractive work, they tend to live far, far away from these sacrifice zones, from these shadow places. And so they don't feel those effects. But the workers do. The communities that happen to live there, whether those are indigenous communities or others, they feel the effects. And they might have nothing to do with that, with those industries that are driving this problem. In the future, if for those of you with kids or grandkids, what have they contributed to this problem? They're being born into it at quite an advanced state. For those of you who might yet have children, might yet have grandchildren, they will be born into a world that has been wounded by this thing. And that's not something that they are like themselves culpable for, but they are going to be experiencing those wounds in a really profound way, and they can't escape it, right? The climate crisis is this global, intractable problem, and it's multifaceted. It's not like the way we talk about it so much in the media and in our kind of public conversations. You get the impression that if we could just solve the fossil fuel problem, that everything will be fine. But it's not just fossil fuels that have contributed to environmental degradation and to the kind of general climate crisis, right? Like, global warming as a specific kind of phenomena of the general climate crisis, yeah, that's being driven by greenhouse gases. But we also have like microplastics in everything that's poisoning fish, and all of us are right full of plastic now because of the clothes we wear, because of the amount of plastics that we use everywhere. It's in every single ecosystem all over the world. They're finding microplastics in Arctic sea ice, right? Like thousands of miles from where anybody's using plastic. Plastic is now ubiquitous, and that's causing all sorts of problems. So even if we get the fossil fuel issue under control, there's still the plastics issue. And if we get the fossil fuel thing under control by way of electric cars and nuclear power plants, well, it's not like those forms of energy are waste neutral, right? Like they have toxic waste that they create, and we will have to figure out some way to either store that or deal with it in a way that doesn't continue to poison the land and the water where we put it. So there's no silver bullet. There's no like, well, if we just did this, then we would solve the problem. And that's part of why no action keeps being taken, is because everywhere we look, solving one problem just leads to more problems. I had a pastor once who said that when it comes to sin, there are some who are more sinning than sinned against, and others who are more sinned against than sinning. And this was his way of kind of opening up the kind of the subjective dimension, which I think we can, of sin, which we can see, I think, in the climate crisis, where some of us are more sinning than sinned against. I don't own a car, but I fly quite a lot, and basically, the carbon that I save by not driving, I more than make up for by flying. But people love to point at celebrities or politicians who fly around a lot and live very high carbon intensive lifestyles. And in that kind of situation, we might say that's an example of somebody more sinning than sinned against. Whereas, the indigenous people of northern Manitoba, whose communities were flooded to build hydro dams to power Manitoba Hydro, and their entire way of life, their fish were poisoned with all the mercury that was released into the water as a result of this flooding. They got sick. They had to move. Where they were moved wasn't any good. They got sick there. That's a people that, in this kind of framing of the issue, are more sinned against than sinning, right? Doesn't mean that they live completely carbon neutral lifestyles or anything, but in the kind of the scheme of things, you can kind of see how power and which side of that power differential you're on kind of determines who's more sinning than sinned against, or more sinned against than sinning. And when we say things like very piously, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, yes, that's absolutely true. But I think that tends to flatten out the way in which sin is kind of this wily thing that actually is as much about us doing kind of like certain specific bad acts as also being kind of caught up in structures of sin that both make us do those things and also cause us harms or cause our neighbors harms as a result of them. So hopefully, let me know if thinking through the climate crisis as a kind of metaphor for sin was a kind of a helpful analogy or not. This is the first time I've tried to kind of explain sin in this way. I thought that it might open up things for people who are used to hearing about sin in a more kind of a pious, churchy way, and perhaps this turned on a light for you. If it did, let me know. If this just kind of complicated things more for you, I'd also like to hear that. So drop me a line. What do you think about using the climate crisis as a metaphor for sin? All right, we're going to take a little break now, and then I will come back in just a moment to kind of dive into various like models of the atonement specifically. How is it that Scripture kind of deals with this multifaceted problem of sin? And we'll go through a bunch of scriptures together, and then we'll look briefly at Eugene Rogers' kind of typology, and we'll close with some reflections on Julian. All right, take a break.